Westwind WebSurge is an easy-to-use REST client and load testing tool for Windows. You can use it to create HTTP requests with HTTP verbs, a URL, an optional description, an HTTP header, and for post or put requests, an HTTP body. URLs can either be fully qualified or site relative with a site base URL in the options. You can click the Run button to run the request and get a result back in the preview pane. The preview pane shows you the original request, including headers and body, as well as the response with the header and body. You can easily make changes to the request content and headers and rerun the request. Notice that the request is now broken with a 401, and if we change it back and rerun it, then the request is okay again. The changes made in the preview are reflected in the request editor immediately. The request list on the left allows you to drag and drop items, and you can use the item context menu to do things like toggle the active state, copy requests, move requests, create new requests, and so forth. When you run requests that fail, in this case a 500 error, they show in a different color, in this case red. While successful requests like this Hello World request shows in green. When you're ready to run a load test, click the Start button and notice that requests start warming up and then display some information about the progress of the test. You see the number of requests, requests per second, succeeded and failed requests, and how much time remains in the test. So now we're at the end of the test here, and you'll see the test result displayed in a graph along with some statistics at the top of the page. We can resize the page to see more of the statistics and graph on the page, and then we can review the data that's there. So we have total requests, averages, some percentiles, and then also the amount of data that was sent, both for sending and receiving. On the bottom of the page, you have individual requests listed with their own statistics. Notice the green and red for success and failure requests. You can also capture the report to a printer or a PDF driver by using the Microsoft Printer PDF driver to output to PDF. You can also click on individual requests and review the output that they generate by clicking on the links in the list on the left. Now let's take a look at creating and importing HTTP requests. Let's start with manual imports. In an empty project, click the plus button to add a new request. Start by picking an HTTP verb and then enter a URL that can either be a fully qualified URL, as we're doing here, or a relative URL. Set a name that's optional, and then start adding headers as you see fit. Next, go ahead and run the request to see what comes back. Here, the result comes back as a plain HTML page. Let's add another request. Again, let's add a URL, and in this case, let's use a JSON URL. Let's also add a name that makes it easier to identify in the list. Add some headers, and run the request. So now we can see the JSON result that comes back. Notice that the result is fully formatted for display, so it's easy to view. Now let's go ahead and add another new request. In this case, let's add a post request. But instead of adding a full URL, let's go in and set a site base URL and point it at the base site, and then also save the request file to disk. So now that we've created the site base URL, we can use relative URL, so we can avoid having to type in the domain name each time. We add another description to make it easier to identify in the request list. Add some headers, an accept type in this case, and then I'm going to cheat a little bit by running another JSON request to retrieve a list of artists and pick out one of the JSON records and copy it to my clipboard. Then I go back to my update artist request and paste that record into the post data. I'll make a change in the JSON data, so we'll actually have something to update, and then run the request. And now we have a problem. It's telling me that it's unauthorized. So what I'm going to do is add an authorization header with an empty bearer token to this request. And then I'm going to create another new request for authentication using a post request, calling to the authenticate endpoint, adding a name, some post data, and adding an object with username and password properties and associated values. Then let's move this request to the top of the list and then execute it. And now we receive a token value back from this authentication request. We can capture this value by copying it to the clipboard and then pasting it into the replace authorization section of the configuration for the session. What this does is basically add the bearer token to every request. So now the request works and the authentication succeeds because we've injected the bearer token into the request and returned the proper JSON result. Another approach that you can use to capture requests for a session is to use the capture session in web browser form. You can use this form to browse to a website and capture all the requests in the process. Start by specifying a base URL to the site you want to navigate to, set the capture request button, and optionally set a filter that only captures top-level requests. Then click on the refresh button to load the site and navigate the site as you normally would to capture requests. Notice that the bottom of the form fills in requests as they're navigated. Keep on navigating to capture more requests. And when you're done, click the Capture Request button to stop capturing requests. Click on Save to save all those requests to a session file with the WebSurge extension. The list is loaded into the request viewer on the left, and now you can navigate the requests as you would normally with WebSurge from manually created requests. As you can see, you captured all the data, including cookies and authorization headers, and the requests should just work when you run them now. Another way to import sessions into WebSurge is by using the OpenAPI and Swagger import. Open the Swagger OpenAPI import form, paste in your URL, and let it go to retrieve a list of requests. You can browse the list of requests, run a few of the requests as is, and they should just work, and return results as you would expect. But notice that some results return values as placeholders. For example, there's IDs here that need to be replaced in the request in order for it to run. So go into the HTTP request and replace it with the real value, then rerun the request, and you should get a result back. For post requests, you notice that the data shows the types for the individual values. And so you have to replace the individual values with real values to make the requests run. So here I'm replacing the username and password and the authenticate and remove the fields that are not actually used. Then rerun, and you can see that the request now works. Now let's take a quick look at session configuration. Each one of the requests that is executed has a configuration associated with it that you can set in the session configuration screen. So some of the more common ones are the site base URL, a set of users, which we'll get back to. You can update headers from an existing request. So when a request comes in, the headers are actually replaced. There's the thread count, the seconds to run, a delay time that specifies how much time to delay between individual requests, the number of warm-up seconds, the bearer token that we already saw. You can also replace a cookie value and some session header related values that you can set as well. You can also create custom users for load tests that allow you to customize individual requests. You can start by enabling custom users and then going to the user management form where you can add individual users. There are settings that are global, like an authorization header and cookie, or URL-specific overrides, where you can specify a URL and then override specific headers or add form variables that override requests for that particular user. Here, I'm adding form variables for a HTML-based input form for that particular request. And I can also do the same thing for a JSON request by simply setting a value in there. User processing is optional, and you can choose to not use users at all, and WebSurge will create users for you. By disabling, you get the raw requests that are sent as is, and the users are created by WebSurge on its own. WebSurge also has support for a command line interface that you can use. By default, it uses a WebSurge file that you can reference in the command line command that you apply. When you run this test, it will show you progress information as the test runs. This is slightly accelerated here. And then it gives you a complete summary of the request processing that occurred. Thanks for taking the time for watching this video. To find out more about WebSurge, go to the website where you can download a free evaluation copy for you to try out.